Clint Eastwood didn't say yes to many things anymore. At 94, he'd long stopped chasing spotlights or headlines. He preferred the quiet rhythm of his ranch, the company of old dogs, and the kind of silence that only comes when you've seen enough of the world to know most noise isn't worth listening to. But when a letter arrived, handwritten, not typed, about a veterans outreach program tied to his latest film, he paused. The program wasn't flashy. No press tours, no photo ops. Just real help. Counseling, job training, housing support for those who'd served and come home to find the world had moved on without them. That was something he understood. He read the letter twice. Then he called his assistant and said, "Tell them I'll do it." The "it" was a guest spot on a popular late-night talk show. Not his usual scene. He hadn't done one of these in over a decade. But the producers had agreed to weave the veterans' cause into the conversation. No hard sell, just a mention. That felt right to him. He wasn't there to plug a movie. He was there because somewhere out there, a young man or woman might be sitting alone in a VA waiting room, wondering if anyone still saw them. If his face on a screen for 10 minutes could remind them they mattered, then it was worth the trip. The show's host had built her reputation on sharp humor and fearless banter. She'd interviewed presidents, rock stars, and tech billionaires, always with a wink and a well-timed jab. Her team loved her energy. Audiences loved her fearlessness. When they told her Eastwood was coming on, she grinned. "The man with no filter meets the woman who says it all," she joked. Her producer chuckled, but added a quiet warning. "He's not like other guests." "Don't push too hard," she waved it off. "Relax, I know how to read a room." Backstage on the night of the taping, the air buzzed with the usual pre-show chaos. Makeup artists darting between chairs, stagehands adjusting lights, writers scribbling last-minute tweaks. Eastwood sat calmly in a folding chair, wearing a simple navy sweater and dark slacks. No entourage. No demands. He sipped water and watched the crew move with quiet curiosity, like he was studying a different species. When the host walked by to say hello, she was struck by how still he was. Not stiff, just present in a way that made the noise around him seem suddenly loud. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, extending her hand. Huge honor. He stood slowly, shook her hand with a firm but gentle grip, and nodded. "Thanks for having me." His voice was softer than she expected. Not weak, just worn smooth by time like Riverstone. She found herself lowering her own voice without thinking. The audience was already seated, murmuring with excitement. When the red light on the camera blinked on, the host bounded out to thunderous applause. She opened with her usual flair, quick jokes about current events, a playful roast of a trending celebrity, and then, with a dramatic pause, announced her guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, a legend who needs no introduction, but I'm giving him one anyway." Eastwood walked out to a standing ovation. He raised a hand in quiet thanks, took his seat, and settled in like he was visiting an old friend's porch. The host leaned in, smiling. "You haven't done one of these shows in forever. What changed your mind?" He gave a small shrug. "Sometimes you say yes to things that matter more than you." She laughed lightly. "That's very Clint Eastwood of you." The first few minutes flowed easily. She asked about his early days in Hollywood, his love for jazz, how he still rode horses every morning. He answered with dry wit and surprising warmth. At one point, he mentioned how he'd once fixed a broken fence with a piece of chewing gum and a paperclip. The audience ate it up. Even the host seemed genuinely charmed. But then came the turn. She glanced at her notes, then back at him, eyes glinting with that familiar spark, the one that said she was about to go off script. "Now your new film? It's quiet, slow, lots of long stares at sunsets. My producer actually fell asleep during the screening." She laughed and the audience joined in. "I mean, no offense, but is this your retirement movie? Like, here's Clint sitting on a porch remembering when he used to shoot bad guys?" She leaned back, clearly pleased with herself, waiting for his chuckle or a self-deprecating quip. It was the kind of joke she'd made about other aging stars, always forgiven, often applauded for its honesty. Eastwood didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He just looked at her, really looked, as if seeing past the makeup, the bright lights, the rehearsed persona. His eyes, still sharp beneath the familiar squint, held something she hadn't prepared for. Not anger, but disappointment. The kind you feel when someone you thought was paying attention turns out to have missed the whole point. The laughter in the studio faded into an uneasy hush. A stagehand froze mid-step. Even the band stopped tuning their instruments. The host shifted in her chair, suddenly aware that the room had gone too quiet. She opened her mouth to pivot, to toss out another joke and reset the mood. But before she could speak, Eastwood leaned forward slightly. His hands rested on his knees. He wasn't performing. He wasn't playing a role. He was just a man speaking plainly. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew the interview had changed. But that moment, the reply, the silence, the shift, would come later. For now, in this first part of the story, what mattered was how it began. Not with fireworks, but with a quiet yes from a man who rarely said yes anymore. And a host who thought she knew how the night would go, never guessing that one careless line would unravel everything she thought she understood about respect, legacy, and the weight of words. Outside the studio, the city hummed on unaware. Inside, something fragile had just been tested. And though no one knew it yet, that test would ripple far beyond the stage lights, touching not just the two people on the couch, but thousands watching at home, some of them veterans themselves, some of them just looking for a little kindness in a noisy world. Eastwood didn't move. He waited, and for the first time in a long time, the host didn't know what to say next. The silence stretched longer than any commercial break. It wasn't the kind of quiet that follows a bad joke, awkward, waiting to be filled, but something heavier, like the air before a storm. The host sat frozen for half a second too long, her smile still pasted on, but her eyes flickered with something new. Uncertainty. She'd made jokes like this 100 times before. About actors, politicians, even royalty. Nobody ever took it seriously. It was just part of the game. Light, fast, forgettable. But this wasn't a game to him. She cleared her throat, ready to pivot, to toss out a quick, "Just kidding," and move on. But Eastwood spoke first. Not loudly, not sharply. Just enough to cut through the noise she'd been hiding behind. "You know," he said, his voice low but clear. "That film wasn't made for people who fall asleep in screenings." The audience didn't laugh. They didn't gasp. They just listened. He didn't look angry. If anything, he seemed tired. Not of her, but of the way people so often mistook quietness for emptiness. He leaned back slightly, hands still resting on his knees, and continued. "It's about a man who spent his life thinking action was the answer. Then one day he wakes up alone and realizes the real battles were the ones he never fought, inside himself." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her usual reflex, to deflect with humor, suddenly felt cheap, like throwing a rubber chicken into a funeral. Eastwood went on, not as a movie star, but as someone who'd lived long enough to see how stories echo in real lives. "I made that film for the guys who came home from places like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, and found nobody waiting to hear what they'd been through. Not the explosions, the silence after, the weight of it." He paused, and this time the silence felt different, respectful, almost sacred. The host glanced at her producer off camera. A subtle shake of the head told her, "Don't interrupt. Don't joke, just listen," and so she did. Eastwood wasn't lecturing. He wasn't scolding. He was sharing something real, the way an older neighbor might lean over a fence and tell you about a mistake he made 50 years ago. Not to shame you, but so you wouldn't make the same one. "You can laugh at the squint," he said gently, almost kindly. "Hell, I've laughed at it myself. But don't laugh at the men and women who saw something in those old roles. Something that got them through a dark night. That wasn't just acting. That was hope dressed up in a cowboy hat." A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. A stagehand near the curtain stood completely still, tools forgotten in his hand. The host felt her chest tighten. She'd prepared questions about box office numbers and director cameos. She hadn't prepared for this, for truth, raw and unvarnished, delivered without fanfare. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about ratings or viral clips. She was just human. She swallowed. I didn't mean to." He held up a hand, not to stop her, but to ease her. "I know you didn't," he said. "Most folks don't. They see the surface, the hat, the glare, the old movies, and they think that's all there is. But stories stick to people in ways we don't always see." He looked out at the audience now, not as fans, but as fellow travelers. "Back in '68, I met a young Marine at a USO show in Da Nang, barely 19. He told me he watched High Plains Drifter on a bootleg tape before his first patrol. Said it made him feel like he could face anything. I thought he was just being kind. But years later I got a letter from his mother. Said he didn't make it home. But in his journal he'd written that on his worst days, he'd imagine walking like the guy in that film. Quiet, steady, like he knew who he was. Eastwood's voice didn't break, but something in it softened like worn leather. That's not about me. That's about him. And the millions like him who carry invisible wounds. So when you call a film boring because it's slow, you're not just talking about pacing. You're talking about lives that moved slowly because they were caring too much. The host stared at her lap. Her notes, neatly printed, color-coded, suddenly looked ridiculous. All those punchlines, all those gotcha questions. They felt like toys in a room full of grown-ups dealing with real things. She looked up. "I'm sorry," she said, and this time it wasn't part of the script. It wasn't for the cameras. It was just her, small and sincere. I didn't see it that way." Eastwood nodded once. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. Nobody does until they do. The band, sensing the moment, played a soft, gentle chord, not to cue a break, but to honor the shift. The audience didn't applaud. They sat in quiet reverence as if they'd just witnessed something rare. Not a celebrity interview, but a real conversation between two people, stripped of roles and routines. Backstage, the producer exhaled. He'd been bracing for disaster, a walk-off, a feud, a social media firestorm. Instead, he'd just watched a masterclass in grace under fire. And from the guest, no less. As the segment neared its end, the host didn't try to lighten the mood. She didn't force a joke or rush to the next topic. She simply asked, "What do you hope people take away from your film?" Eastwood thought for a moment that it's never too late to listen, to yourself, to others, especially the ones who've been quiet too long. When the red light went off, the studio stayed silent for a full 10 seconds before the applause began. Not loud or flashy, but deep, steady, like waves on a shore. The host stood and offered her hand again. This time, when he took it, she held on a second longer. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small nod. "You're welcome." As he walked off stage, no fanfare, no entourage, just a man in a sweater heading back to his car, the host sat back down in her chair. The makeup artist rushed over with powder, but she waved her off. She needed to feel this, the discomfort, the clarity, the strange mix of shame and gratitude. Later that night, long after the crew had gone home, she sat alone in her office, replaying the footage on her laptop. She watched herself make the joke. She watched the shift in his eyes. She watched the audience go still. And for the first time in her career, she didn't care how many views the clip would get. She cared about what it meant. Because somewhere out there, a veteran might be watching. A young person might be watching. And they'd see that even on a flashy talk show, in a world full of noise, two people could choose to speak and listen with honesty. And that, she realized, was worth more than any punchline. The moment the taping ended, the studio lights dimmed just enough to signal the shift from performance to reality. Crew members moved quietly, packing cables and folding chairs, speaking in hushed tones as if they'd just left a chapel. No one laughed. No one cracked a joke. Even the usual post-show buzz, the clatter of coffee cups, the chatter about weekend plans, was absent. Something had happened that night. Something that couldn't be edited out or smoothed over with a laugh track. Back in her dressing room, the host sat alone, still in her stage clothes, the bright lights of the set replaced by the soft glow of a vanity mirror. She stared at her reflection, not seeing the styled hair or the camera-ready makeup, but the expression that had flickered across her face right after Eastwood spoke. Surprise, then shame, then something quieter, harder to name. She replayed his words in her head, not as sound bites, but as sentences that carried weight. That wasn't just acting. That was hope dressed up in a cowboy hat. She'd never thought of it that way. To her, those old films were relics. Entertaining, sure, but distant, like black and white photos in a museum. She hadn't considered that for someone else. They might be lifelines. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her producer. "You okay?" She typed back, "Yeah, just thinking." She didn't add that she felt like she'd been handed a mirror and didn't like what she saw. Not because she was a bad person, but because she'd been careless with something that mattered to others, and that was worse. She pulled up the raw footage on her tablet, watched the moment again, saw how her joke landed, not with a laugh but with a kind of collective flinch. Noticed how Eastwood didn't raise his voice, didn't scold, didn't walk off. He just spoke, like he was talking to a neighbor over a fence, not a TV host in front of millions. There was no performance in it. Just truth, offered gently. She thought about her own grandfather, a Navy veteran who rarely spoke about his time overseas. He'd loved those old westerns. She used to tease him about it, still watching cowboys pop. And he'd just smile and say, they knew how to stand tall even when the world was falling apart. She'd thought it was nostalgia. Now she wondered if it was something deeper. A knock at the door. Her assistant poked her head in. You want to grab dinner? The team's heading to that Italian place down the street. She shook her head. Not tonight. I need some air. She walked out of the studio alone into the cool night. The city hummed around her. Cars, distant sirens, the chatter of late-night pedestrians. But she felt strangely removed from it all. She passed a bus stop where a man in a worn jacket sat with a duffel bag at his feet. His eyes were tired, his posture heavy. She didn't know if he'd served, but something in the way he held himself, the quiet dignity beneath the exhaustion, reminded her of Eastwood's words. She almost stopped to say something, but hesitated. What would she even say? Sorry I made fun of Hope tonight. Instead, she kept walking, but the image stayed with her. Back at her apartment, she poured a glass of water. No wine, not tonight, and sat by the window. She opened her laptop and searched for the Veterans Outreach program Eastwood had mentioned. The website was simple, no flashy graphics. Just stories. A former medic now teaching yoga to fellow vets. A young woman who rebuilt her life after losing her leg overseas. A group of retirees who meet every Tuesday to fix up old motorcycles together. At the bottom of the page was a quote. Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. She read it 3 times. Then she clicked on a link to donate. Not for publicity, not for a tax write-off, just because it felt like the right thing to do. But it wasn't enough. She knew that. Money helped, yes. But what Eastwood had pointed to was something else. Respect. Attention. The willingness to see people not as symbols or stereotypes, but as whole human beings with stories that deserved to be heard, not mocked. She thought about her show. About how often she'd used humor as a shield, quick, sharp, always in control. It had worked for years. But tonight, for the first time, she wondered if that kind of humor sometimes cut deeper than she intended. Not because she meant harm, but because she hadn't stopped to consider who might be listening. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from her editor. The clip of Eastwood's response is already trending. People are calling it the moment TV grew up. She didn't click the link. She didn't want to see the hot takes or the memes. She just wanted to sit with what had happened without turning it into content. Later, she called her grandfather. It was late, but she knew he'd be awake. Old men and old habits, he always said. When he answered, voice gravelly with sleep, she didn't lead with small talk. She said, Pop, remember those westerns you used to watch? Can you tell me why you liked them so much? There was a pause. Then softly, because the hero never talked much. But when he did, you knew he meant it. And he never left anyone behind. She closed her eyes. I get it now. You always were a smart kid, he said. Just needed the right moment to see it. She hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. The next morning, she arrived at the studio earlier than usual. No makeup, no script notes, just a notebook and a pen. She found her head writer in the break room sipping coffee. Hey, she said. Can we talk about next week's monologue? I want to do something different. He raised an eyebrow. Different how? I want to talk about last night. Not as a gotcha moment. Not as drama. Just, honestly, about how I got it wrong and what I learned. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. That's risky. I know, she said. But maybe it's time we took a real risk. As the day went on, she met with her team, not to spin the story, but to listen. She asked the researchers to find more about the Veterans Program. She asked the social media team to share the donation link, no commentary, and she asked the director to keep the raw, uncut version of Eastwood's response in the broadcast. No edits, no cuts to audience reaction. Let people sit with it, she said. That evening, alone again, she wrote in her notebook, humor is powerful, but it's not the only tool. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop joking and start listening. She didn't know if her apology would be enough. She didn't know if Eastwood would even see it. But she knew this. She couldn't go back to pretending that words didn't matter. Not after seeing how one quiet reply could shake a room and a person to their core. And in that stillness, in the space between regret and resolve, she found something unexpected, not shame but clarity, a chance to do better. Not for ratings, not for praise, but because it was simply the right thing to do. The city outside her window kept moving, but inside, for the first time in a long time, she felt still, anchored not by fame or wit, but by something deeper, the quiet courage to admit she'd been wrong, and the hope that it wasn't too late to make it right. The morning after the taping, the host woke before her alarm, not because she was anxious, though she was, but because her mind wouldn't stop circling back to one image, Eastwood's hands resting on his knees, calm and steady, like they'd held the weight of 1,000 unsaid things and never once trembled. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying not just what he'd said, but how he'd said it. No anger, no performance, just truth offered like a gift even when it stung. She made coffee black and sat by the window as the city slowly came alive. Delivery trucks rumbled down the street. A jogger passed, breath visible in the cool air. Normal life. But nothing felt normal anymore. Her phone buzzed nonstop, texts from friends, calls from agents, alerts from her social media team. The clip of the exchange had gone viral overnight. Not in the usual celebrity feud way, but something quieter, more thoughtful. People weren't mocking her. They were quoting Eastwood, sharing stories about parents, uncles, neighbors who'd served. One veteran wrote, "Thank you for finally showing us as more than just props in someone else's story." That hit her hardest. She scrolled through the comments, not for praise or criticism, but to listen. And what she heard wasn't outrage, it was relief. Relief that someone had spoken up for them, that their quiet pain had been seen even for a moment on a stage that usually only celebrated noise. Her producer called just after 8. "Network's nervous," he said, voice low. "They're worried you'll look weak if you apologize on air." She stirred her coffee, watching the steam curl upward. "I'm not apologizing to look strong or weak," she said. "I'm apologizing because it's true." He was silent for a beat. Then, "You know they might cut your segment if you go off script like that." "Then they'll have to find someone else to host," she replied, and meant it. She spent the day in meetings, but not the usual kind. Instead of rehearsing punchlines, she sat with her writers and asked them to help her find the right words, not clever ones, but honest ones. She wanted to explain not just that she was sorry, but why, not to save face, but to show that she'd actually listened. One writer, a quiet woman who rarely spoke up, shared that her brother had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and came home with wounds no one could see. "He used to watch those old films too," she said. Said they made him feel like he still had a code even when everything else fell apart. The host nodded. "That's the part I missed." By late afternoon, she had a draft. Not polished, not perfect, just real. She read it aloud in her office, voice catching once or twice, but she didn't stop. This wasn't about delivery. It was about meaning. That evening, she drove to a small community center on the edge of town, one that partnered with the veterans program Eastwood supported. She didn't tell anyone she was coming. No cameras, no press. Just her, a box of pastries, and a need to do something that didn't involve a screen. Inside, a dozen men and women sat in a circle, some in wheelchairs, some with service dogs at their feet, all listening as one of them shared about struggling to sleep through the night. The room was warm, lit by soft lamps, the air smelling of coffee and old books. No one noticed her at first. When they did, there was no fanfare, just a nod, a quiet, "You're welcome here." She stayed for an hour. Didn't speak much, just listened. And in that room, she heard things she'd never heard on TV. Stories of guilt, of friendship, of trying to find peace after carrying war inside for years. One woman said, "People think we want pity. We don't. We just want to be seen." The host felt her throat tighten. That was it, exactly. She hadn't seen them. She'd seen a punchline. On the drive home, rain began to fall, tapping gently on the windshield. She thought about how easy it was to reduce people to roles, the tough guy, the sad veteran, the aging star, when the truth was always more complicated, more human. Eastwood wasn't just a squint and a gun. Those men and women weren't just uniforms or statistics. And she wasn't just a host with a quick wit. She was someone who'd made a mistake and now had a choice: hide behind her brand, or step into something truer. She parked outside her building and sat for a moment, watching the rain blur the streetlights into soft halos. Her phone lit up, a message from her assistant. Eastwood's team reached out. They said he appreciated your honesty. She didn't know if that was true or just polite, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd started to change. Not because of pressure, but because something inside her had shifted. Back in her apartment, she opened her laptop and watched the full, unedited segment again. This time, she didn't focus on herself. She watched the audience, the way their laughter died, the way they leaned forward when Eastwood spoke, the way a man in the third row wiped his eyes. She saw how the camera lingered on silence and how powerful that silence was. No music, no cuts. Just two people. One speaking from a lifetime of experience, the other finally learning to listen. She thought about her grandfather again. How he'd never asked for thanks. How he just wanted to be understood. The next day, she arrived at the studio early, the draft of her monologue folded in her pocket. She didn't rehearse it. She didn't need to. The words were already part of her now. As she sat in the makeup chair, the stylist said, "You seem different." "I feel different," she replied. When the red light came on that night, she walked out to applause, but it felt different this time. Lighter somehow. She stood at the center of the stage, looked into the camera, and took a breath. "I owe you all an apology," she began, voice steady. "Not because I messed up on live TV, but because I forgot something important. That stories belong to people. And when you make fun of a story, you're not just joking about a movie. You're joking about the people who found meaning in it." She didn't look at her notes. She just spoke like she was talking to a friend. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't performing. She was just being human. The night of the apology, the studio felt different. Not in the lights or the set, those were the same, but in the air. It was quieter, like everyone knew something real was about to happen. No one cracked jokes backstage. The band played softer during the intro. Even the audience seemed to sit up straighter, as if they sensed this wasn't just another monologue. She walked out without her usual bounce. No flashy entrance, no quick one-liner to warm up the crowd. She stood at the center of the stage, hands empty. No notes, no teleprompter. Just her in the silence. "I owe you all an apology," she began. Her voice didn't waver, but it carried something new. Weight, maybe, or humility. "Not because I messed up on live TV, but because I forgot something important. That stories belong to people." She paused, letting the words settle. No rush, no punchline waiting in the wings. "When I made that joke about Clint Eastwood's movie," she continued, "I thought I was being funny. I thought I was just teasing an old film. But what I didn't see, what I refused to see, was that for a lot of people that film and others like it weren't just entertainment. They were reminders that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it just shows up." She looked out at the audience, not as viewers, but as people who'd also lost someone or felt unseen, or tried to do the right thing and gotten it wrong. "I've spent years thinking my job was to make people laugh," she said. "And that's part of it. But I forgot the other part, to respect the things that matter to you, especially when I don't understand them yet." A few people nodded. Others wiped their eyes. No one clapped, not yet. They were listening, really listening. The way people do when they know someone's speaking from the heart. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't spin it into a lesson or a brand moment. She just told the truth, that she'd been careless, that she'd learned, and that she wanted to do better. Not for ratings, but because it was right. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then slowly the applause began. Not the loud, automatic kind that follows a joke, but something deeper, steady, warm, like a shared understanding passing through the room. Backstage, her producer stood with his arms crossed, but his eyes were bright. One of the camera operators whispered, "That was the most real thing I've seen on this show in 10 years. Later that night, alone in her dressing room, she got a message from the Veterans Outreach Program. Donations had tripled in 24 hours. Volunteers had signed up by the dozens. A school in Ohio even wrote to say they were using the clip in a lesson about empathy. She smiled, but it wasn't pride she felt. It was gratitude. Not for the attention, but for the chance to make things right. 2 mornings later, a plain manila envelope arrived at her office. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in neat, slightly shaky script. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't standing your ground. It's admitting you missed the mark. You did that with grace. That takes more courage than most ever show. Keep listening. The world needs more of that. See, she read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her notebook, right next to her grandfather's old dog tag, the one he'd given her when she was 12 and asked what it meant to be brave. She didn't post it online. Didn't show it to the press. It wasn't for anyone else. It was a quiet nod between 2 people who'd both chosen honesty over ego, and that was enough. Over the next few weeks, small changes began to ripple through her show. She still told jokes she wasn't about to become a preacher, but they were sharper in a different way, kinder, more thoughtful. She started opening each episode with a short segment called Real Stories, where everyday people shared moments of quiet courage. A nurse who stayed late during a storm, a teacher who bought groceries for a student's family, a veteran who taught woodworking to kids in his neighborhood. No drama, no tears on cue. Just real life told simply, viewers responded. Not with viral clips, but with letters. One came from a woman whose husband had served in Iraq and rarely spoke about it. After your apology, she wrote, he watched the old Eastwood films again for the first time in years. Then he talked to me. Really talked. That letter stayed pinned to her bulletin board. Months passed. The buzz around the incident faded as these things do. But something had shifted. Not just for her, but for the show itself. It felt less like a performance and more like a conversation. And conversations, she was learning, required listening as much as speaking. One evening, long after taping ended, she found herself driving past the community center again. On a whim, she parked and walked in. The same group was meeting. They greeted her like an old friend, not a celebrity. She sat in the circle, said little, but stayed late, helping clean up afterward. As she left, an older man with a cane stopped her at the door. You know, he said, most folks think heroes are the ones who charge into battle. But sometimes the bravest thing is to stop. Turn around and say, I was wrong. That's the kind of courage that changes things. She thanked him, got in her car and drove home under a sky full of stars. Back in her apartment, she poured a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city hummed below, full of people making mistakes, learning, trying again. She thought about Eastwood, probably back on his ranch, feeding his dogs, watching the sunset without needing anyone to applaud. And she realized something. Legacy wasn't about never falling. It was about how you rose when you did. The next morning, she arrived at the studio early. Not to rehearse, but to thank the crew, each one by name. She brought coffee, listened to their stories, asked how their kids were doing. Later that day, during a commercial break, a young intern nervously approached her. I just wanted to say, your apology meant a lot to me. My dad's a vet. He never talks about it, but he watched your show that night. And for the first time, he said someone finally got it. The host put a hand on the intern's shoulder. Thank you for telling me. That night, as she walked out to begin the show, she didn't feel the usual rush of nerves or excitement. She felt calm, grounded, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because she was perfect, but because she was trying. And in a world that often rewards noise, that quiet effort to listen, to learn, to change was its own kind of revolution. The red light blinked on. She smiled, not for the cameras, but because she finally understood. The most powerful stories aren't the ones we tell about ourselves. They're the ones we help others feel seen in, and that was worth more than any laugh ever could be.